Woo, thank you, Eric. All right, thank you, Dr. Day, for that great introduction. I wanted to lead off with this picture. I was just married, as Elizabeth mentioned, in June, and that's been one of the peaks in my life. And if you have CMT, you know that CMT comes with peaks and it comes with valleys. And I just wanted to lead off with a peak today. Through my experience of the peaks and valleys of CMT, I've come up with some rules to keep me moving forward. And even though my forward movement isn't always graceful, that's why I've called this talk Tumbling Forward, by the way. It doesn't matter as long as I'm moving forward. And I wanted to share just a few of these rules with you today. These are my rules. You'll all have your own rules. And frankly, I don't even follow mine half of the time. But I do think that if you have CMT, you may find these rules particularly helpful. Because we tend to have some similarities, particularly in how we look at the world. For example, if you look at this picture and you don't have CMT, you might think something like, oh, isn't that sweet? But if you do have CMT and you're looking at this picture, you're more likely thinking to yourself, is she seriously walking on grass? That's a terrible idea. Yes, it is, by the way. And if you have some more details, like the fact that both my father and I have CMT, you can probably even imagine what our internal dialogue was like in that moment. Small steps. Don't fall. Keep looking up and smile for the photographer. And just please don't end up on YouTube tomorrow. What was worse is that our wedding grounds had been infiltrated by a devious little enemy that looked something like this. Not adorable when it's your wedding day. So our dialogue was more like, small steps, don't fall, go for hole. Luckily, I've been searching YouTube and nothing's there so far. When my father and I made it up to the aisle, it was an incredibly emotional moment. First, we were just very grateful that we'd made it up there. But it was emotional for a lot of reasons. One of which is that not long before, we wouldn't have imagined that I would ever be walking down the aisle. Not because I'm not marriage material, mind you, but because by the age of 18, I required a wheelchair and could not walk without pain. This is my grandma and little me. My grandma, well, when I grew up, I watched Grandma put on her leg braces. And at the time, I didn't think anything of it. I thought it was just what grandmas do. As I grew up, I discovered that my grandma had CMT. And Grandma and I were very close. And though she's no longer alive today, a little part of her will always live on in me, in the form of a duplicated gene on chromosome 17 that gave my dad and then myself CMT type 1A. As I grew up and entered my teenage years, I too would be putting on leg braces just like Grandma. I found myself beginning to isolate myself from my peers. I started turning down invitations to parties or to their houses because I was just so scared that I might encounter stares, and that then my classmates might see how different from them I was becoming. A few events from this time really stand out to me. When I was a freshman, my classmates and I went to see a Shakespearean play, Julius Caesar, and it was in this incredible building with floor-to-ceiling windows all the way around. And as my classmates and I were walking up to this building, I could see our reflections, and I could see the reflections of other people passing by. One reflection caught my attention. It was an older woman who was walking up the hill toward the building. She was hunched over, and she was taking slow, careful steps. I watched her out of the corner of my eye until suddenly I found myself face to face with that woman. She looked back at me, confused. The old woman was me. I had been looking at my own reflection the whole time. And it wasn't until that moment at age 14, that I realized the effects CMT had had. What a toll it had taken on my body in such a short time. And it was in that moment that I realized that the old woman was me, and I was only 14. School field trips are full of potential pitfalls when you have CMT. We saw the play, which was Julius Caesar. We pretended to like it, and then it was time to go. The theater looked something like this. Yeah, I know, this is just the recipe for disaster. And at the end, they expected us all to climb these stairs and exit at the top, and our schools were called out one at a time. I'm just waiting in terror for them to call my school. And when they do, I have no choice but to enter the aisle and start trudging up the stairs, grabbing each chair one by one. And I make it but a few aisles up before my legs are like, nope. And I can't get up any more of those stairs. Luckily, one of my teachers saw my peril, and she maneuvered through the crowds to help me. And as my teacher was literally pulling me up each stair, I could hear teenage boys from another school yelling behind us, "Move! Move!" I was mortified. And while I did get up those stairs, I cried myself to sleep that night. I think this is a good time to call out one of my first rules for Tumbling Forward. Teenage boys can wait. Thank you, right? This is an important life lesson. If you had asked me at the time what I learned from that experience, it would have been something like, don't go to the theater. Now I look at it a little bit differently. At the time, I felt bad for having CMT. I felt ashamed, and I almost felt like it was wrong of me to go to places like theaters where I might be a bit of an inconvenience to others. But I look at that differently now. It's okay if I move a little bit slowly, right? It's okay if people have to wait a few extra seconds so that I too can enjoy a play or a movie. And it's often in these encounters that I see the true kindness of strangers who take the time to open a door, to help me up a stair. When you have CMT, you often, I think, have rules just around doors and stairs. And not long after that experience in the theater, I wound up having to leave high school due to a very traumatic knee injury that involved me falling in several cans of paint, but that's for another day. And I went to a local community college at age 15, and it was a great experience except for the doors. But first you have to understand that I was really excited about community college because no one knew me. No one had seen the experiences in the theater or with those cans of paint, and I could reinvent myself. I could be a Bethany without CMT. And there was only one small flaw with that plan, which is that I do have CMT. So my fantasy lasted about a week until I found myself in front of this lovely building here, on the ground, after being taken down by a handicap door that was moving a little bit faster than I was. It's horrible things sometimes. So I found myself on the ground with a new door nemesis, but I said to myself, hey, at least nobody saw it happen. That thought had barely formed in my head when I found myself looking into the face of a campus police officer who was shouting loudly into his walkie-talkie, "We have a girl down! A girl down! I need backup! Backup!" Serious. And shockingly, within 5 minutes, backup did arrive, 2 more security guards speeding up in their little golf carts, lights flashing, and declaring that they had been dispatched, and the situation is now under control, and the girl is on her feet and doing okay. Very loudly, just in case anyone hadn't yet heard. Yeah, this was just another one of those days. I think this rule speaks for itself. I've always dreamt big. At age 5, my dream was to be a princess. But by age 17, I had downgraded that dream to be a neuroscientist, which is a big letdown, I know, from princess. But I found this tremendous college in Pennsylvania that had an amazing pre-med program that basically promised if you could get through it, they'd get you into medical school. So I went to this beautiful place in the snowy hills of Pennsylvania. And if you have CMT, you're probably already thinking that snowy hills sound like a really bad idea. That's because you're smarter than I was at 17. I progressed really rapidly my first winter there, to the point where I needed a wheelchair or a scooter to get just about anywhere, to the point where I couldn't take a step without pain, and often, on a very inaccessible campus, I'd have to decide between getting to the cafeteria for dinner and being able to go to class the next day. After a very long and brutal winter, it was time to go home back in Michigan for the summer. But when you have CMT, summer doesn't always mean fun in the sun. Actually, I'm not a very big fan of sand. It's horrible stuff. For me, it meant, great, I get to go back to working with my physical therapist. And despite the photo, I actually had a physical therapist that I loved and really respected. And when I went to see her, I said, look, you gotta get me back on track here. This is just not working for me. I wanna be walking again. And I was shocked when my always very conservative physical therapist said, Bethany, we're not going to get you the results you want for physical therapy. It's time to see a surgeon. So I took her advice and I went to see a surgeon. I didn't like what he said, so I went to see another surgeon. And I was very dismayed that he said the same thing, and they both described 20-plus procedures over the course of 2 surgeries to let me walk again. And they described the promise of walking without pain. But the second surgeon said some particularly concerning things with regards to my feet. He started the conversation with, first, I'm going to break your big toe. Never a good conversation starter. Take note, doctors. I don't think any of you would do that. He used the words oscillating saw a couple times. Yeah, no. But the worst thing he said, the absolute worst thing, was take time off from school and do these surgeries now. This was not in my plan. I had really decided that CMT wasn't going to interfere with my life, that it wasn't going to interfere with my goals or my plans. But as I went home and I thought about it, and I was struggling so much to just get up the stairs to my room, I realized that I couldn't do it anymore, and I decided to take the time off from school and do the surgeries then. For those of you that have been through surgery, it's a very long and a very painful process. But it was all worth it for me when the surgeon unwrapped my foot for the first time, and it was the most beautiful foot I'd ever seen. And don't get me wrong, it was a really ugly foot, okay? And I called it my little Frankenfoot, lovingly. But it was straight. It was straight. And it had the promise that one day I would be able to walk on them. This is just a couple shots of before and after. Here, my left leg had been operated on and my right hadn't. And you can see the dramatic change and why I was having a little bit of trouble walking on them when they were both like the right. I learned an important rule through this experience, which is that sometimes I do need to be willing to forge a new path. I had thought that it was really noble to deny my CMT and deny that it would ever have any impact on my life. But I do have CMT, and I've come to accept that, or rather, I've come to accept myself with CMT, because we still have a bit of a love-hate relationship just without the love. And sometimes when you forge that new path, it ends up being even brighter than the one you had originally envisioned. I never did go back to the college in the snowy hills. Instead, I moved to Pennsylvania, where I was promised no snow, or not Pennsylvania, I moved to California, where I was promised no snow, and so far it has lived up to that promise. Thank you, California. I ended up transferring to UC Berkeley. I changed my major to nutritional science, physiology, and metabolism, and I created a new, bright path. But my first summer at UC Berkeley, I was in a writing class, and there were only 7 of us in this class, and partway through the semester, the teacher gave us an assignment. And the assignment was to write about something that truly terrifies us, to write about an experience that scares us. And we only had one night to write it, so I went home that night, and I'm in front of my laptop, and I'm racking my brain trying to think about what to write. I could write about heights. Everyone's afraid of heights, especially if you have CMT. I could write about the crazy dog across the street. But I really knew what the thing was that terrified me. So I wrote my paper, and I closed my laptop, and as soon as I was done, I was filled with so much regret for having written that down on paper. And I asked myself, how can I possibly turn this into my teacher tomorrow? What is she going to think about me? And I tried to get that fear out of my mind, and I basically calmed myself down with the idea that, hey, there's only a few weeks left in this semester. Hopefully I never see the woman again, even if she always looks at me differently. The next morning, I walk into class, and I'm clutching my little paper. I sit down. The teacher says, "Class, today, for the first time, you will all be reading your papers aloud." Oh, no, 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 no. This could not happen to me. And I'm looking for any possible escape route. I'm thinking of feigning, illness, death, whatever can get me out of reading this paper. Meanwhile, the first student goes up. He reads his paper on his fear of heights. Should have gone with heights. Second student, not a second later, goes up and also reads his paper on his fear of heights. I still haven't come up with a good plan to get out of here when I suddenly hear, "Bethany, it's your turn." So I will myself up to the front of the classroom, and I'm shaking with my little paper, and I look out, and I feel like there are just millions of eyes on me in that moment. The thing that truly terrifies me is something that I have to do every day. It's something that I had to do just to get here today, and it's something that most of you wouldn't think anything about. And that thing is crossing the street. It's crossing the 4 lanes of terrifying traffic from Oxford to Addison. Because I have a neurological disorder called CMT. And my nerves don't communicate correctly. And each time I step off that curb, I wonder if today is going to be the day where my leg isn't communicating correctly to my other leg, and I go down in the middle of that street. And I wonder, what are the people in the cars thinking? What are the pedestrians thinking? And I know what they're thinking. They're thinking, why is she walking so slow? Why does she walk funny? What's wrong with her? And each time I step off that curb, I wonder if today is going to be the day where I fall and I can't get back up. I finish and there's just silence. Until suddenly, after a couple minutes, one of the fellow students with the fear of heights, who's this jock, he was at Berkeley on a rowing scholarship. He's got the bleached blonde hair, the blue eyes. He's never spoken to me before. He looks at me with tears in his eyes, and he says, "Bethany, we are all in awe of you." I learned an important rule that day, which is that I had a much bigger fear than crossing the street. And that fear was revealing myself to others and to my peers and revealing my vulnerabilities. But only when I was willing to face those fears, to stand in them, to feel them, was I able to move through them and to connect with my peers in a really powerful and beautiful way that I never would have before. No one else opted to read their papers, by the way. Wasn't an option given to me. I continue to look for new ways to tumble forward, and I continue to find new rules, some of which I follow and some of which I don't all the time. One of the things I do every year is a fundraiser walk to raise money for the CMTA. My first year, I set an outrageous goal of walking 7 miles. This would have been unthinkable before surgery. And I had the just amazing experience of our local group here, which Ori and Tao now lead, surrounding me with their support. They came to cheer me on, to walk with me, and they gave to help me reach my fundraising goal of $7,000 for 7 miles. We've exceeded our goal of fundraising every year, and I've reached my walking goals every year. When people ask me why I walk, I tell them that I walk because I can, and that hasn't always been true. And I realize that CMT is progressive. But for now, I can walk, and I walk for myself. I walk for my grandma. I walk for my dad. I walk for the hundreds, if not thousands, of people that I have now had the privilege to meet who have CMT. And I walk for all of you. It's such a privilege to be here to share some of my rules of how I've learned to tumble forward. And I hope and I challenge all of you to find your rules, because when you find them, wonderful things can happen. Thank you.